In a nutshell, indigenous knowledge, it's not something that is taught in university. It's through a specific cultural practice that, by definition, is completely almost the opposite of being taught. It's passed on. It takes longer than 13 weeks. There's specific knowledge holders. So in a sense, indigenous knowledges cannot be defined. There's a very clear distinction between the discourse of philosophy in Western thought. Giorgio Agamben distinguishes from Aristotle that Aristotelian logic distinguishes two types of discourses: the apophantic discourse and the non-apophantic discourse. The apophantic discourse is literally discourse that are supposed to be true or false, right? So I say if being recorded, you can verify that if it's true or false. But non-apophantic discourse, such as language that commands, language of poetry, prayer, the prayer or the song or the story or the command stays valid regardless of the command being followed, the prayer being answered. It's a prayer regardless of it. So that distinction always moves us away from that discourse of Aristotelian logic. So indigenous knowledges follow that other pathway where it's still knowledge production, but and very, very keen knowledge production, but it's not necessarily fully concerned. It takes into account, but it's not fully concerned with apophantic Aristotelian logic. From a lot of indigenous knowledge perspectives, there's a starting of what might be called ethics. So knowledge production starts with how things not are, but in a sense, for specific purposes, how they should be.
We know that knowledge is a powerful thing, and we need to think about who defines knowledge and who has the power to make those kinds of calls. And so that's where I see a lot of the current debate about decolonising knowledge coming from, particularly as more and more people of colour or of just something identifying in some way that's different to a perceived hegemonic cultural norm come into the academy. There are more and more calls for those positions of power to be shared or overthrown, and I think they're really interesting debates to witness.
One of the great challenges to Australian universities, and we should be more sensitive to that in the humanities and social sciences than anybody else, is Indigenous knowledges and the kinds of shapes they have. We know the history, which was a history of colonial condescension and disparagement. Basically, when white settlers arrived in Australia, they couldn't see much. They didn't notice a built environment, for instance, that they would recognise as being a mark of civilization. They saw Australian Indigenous people as living very close to the earth and as having, just the bare minimum of difference between themselves and an animal existence. And what seems to have taken a very long time to understand was how extraordinarily ramified and complex were Indigenous knowledge practices around, say, to take a very striking example, family relations, and at some point along the way, our anthropologist colleagues got the message through the rest of us that we found it extraordinarily demanding and in some sense mind-bending to understand the complexity of family relations which were carried around in the heads of ordinary Indigenous people as part of their ordinary lives. And whatever kind of knowledge that was one that early Europeans didn't know how to value, and that Europeans thoroughly immersed in those cultures still don't understand very well. Another would be a knowledge of space, ways of plotting and mapping space. And I suspect there are ways of mapping family relations onto space, you know, which then give you a kind of third kind of, so all of those things I think constitute kinds of knowledge that have to find a place in the university, and the only way they're going to find a place in the university is if they're somewhere near the humanities and social sciences. No one else is going to know how to do that work, or even know how to notice that they haven't done it.
For me to believe in truth claims is really problematic because it doesn't leave any room for the creation of new knowledge, for the creation of change, for the creation of new politics. To go back to Urgra, she's talking about the idea of the limits of subjectivity, so the limits of what the subject knows and can know, and she talks about wonder and mystery, and she goes back and reads Descartes to do that in order to create something new. So I think new knowledge can't come about if we think that we have the answers to everything. Philosophia is the love of wisdom, and when Urgra goes back and reads Plato's Symposium, she talks about that love is knowledge, and it's a journey, and it's a passage between ignorance and knowledge, and you never ever get there. So it's a journey, and I think in terms of studying philosophy, in terms of studying at university, in terms of studying any type of humanities, as researchers, we should never think that we have all the answers. Otherwise, what's the point?
There are two kinds of studies in religion proponents, and you could call them splitters on the one hand and joiners on the other. Joiners in studies in religion are people who really believe there is a kind of essence of religion. There's a universal truth in religion, and tucked away behind all the religions of the world is a kind of universal religious truth. So the joiners go looking for this universal religious truth. Splitters, on the other hand, of whom I'm one, would tend to see themselves not so much as studying religion, but studying religions, and they'd see the study of religion as intimately involved with the study of different kinds of cultures. And they'd be, while they wouldn't be absolutely relativist about truth, they'd be pretty soft on the notion that there is such a thing as religious truth. They'd be looking for the way in which truth, or the way in which religion functions and works within societies, the way in which different cultures set up different religious rules, different religious grammars, the way in which, if we want to find out about God, we don't go looking into the starry heavens above, but in the cultures around which inflect the way God is differently construed in the different religious traditions. So I think the dominant mood in studies in religion goes with splitters, but there are lots of people who hanker after the universal truths that joiners do go hunting for.
That is one of the most exciting and one of the most annoying things about history, that you can't ever hammer down a point to say this is exactly what happened, this is the truth of the matter. Yeah, there are always other perspectives on it. There are some schools of history which say that you can reach a truth about the past. Look at Cambridge School, for example. They can say you can recover through contextual study truths, right? You can know definitively that on this day, such and such, Thomas Locke, it's not even a person, John Locke, or Thomas Hobbes, thought, he read this book and that helped him to develop this idea about about the Leviathan or something, the body politic. Sources, there's a limited number of sources, they say contradictory things, and you're supposed to be able to know, if you can barely determine, on what date a certain letter was written, if it's undated, okay? How are you supposed to know what that person was thinking at that time? And what relationship does that then have to truth, right? If you're talking about recovering a truth from history.
I think my opinion on what knowledge is or what fact is changes quite a lot, and I think it just, I think I just become more open to there being various different knowledges. I think when I started doing a lot of historical inquiry, maybe at the beginning of my undergrad perhaps, especially when I was studying other subjects as well in different disciplines, I had a very rigid understanding of what knowledge could be or should be, and certainly I had a very firm belief in fact and truth. And I think over the course of my undergraduate and now graduate career at university, all the lines become blurred, and I think it's there's just so many more complexities to our understandings of knowledge and truth and fact, such that we can almost never claim anything to be truth or anything to be fact or anything to be knowledge, which perhaps mightn't be that a very functional position to take. And I think at some point you do have to at least define your own personal understanding of those things in order to operate. I came across a really great term or phrase this year by Foucault, like subjugated knowledges, which I use for a lot of my research, and sort of like the idea of talking about all these different things that have been repressed or suppressed by various different groups and parties. And sometimes we can understand our role as people in the humanities is to rescue subjugated knowledges, or to resurrect them, or to try to reanalyze them in a different light that makes them viable again. I think I really understand it in terms of knowledges that we're told are viable and told are not viable, and trying to ascertain why they've been classified like that.
But in terms of knowledge, can I jump in there? And I just wanted to say in that how knowledge is also very political and a dangerous tool, and in the ways that knowledge was subjugated, like the history of sexuality, especially in the history of sexuality, knowledge all about marginalized people, or the way the photography was perhaps used in an anthropological kind of drives to make knowledge of the native. So knowledge has been subjugated and shaped, by dominant authorities in the paradigm that we are. So it's very dangerous, and it's quite political as well, as it is enlightening as well in certain frameworks.
We often draw on Donald Schoen's ideas of reflective practice, particularly in a professional context, which in the journalism and communications we are sort of educating future professionals. So, and that is the idea that knowledge is created through action, and that professionals in their practice make decisions in the flow of making things. So it's about being able to recognise those and reflect in your action as you do it to produce better outcomes, and then sort of later going, okay, how did I do that? What worked? What didn't work? How will I do it different that next time? And that way you build your practice.
One of the things I've been working on at the moment is the history of how witchcraft has been treated by colonial administrators in the South Pacific over the last 150 years or so. And key to this often is precisely the question of knowledge and what counts as proper knowledge or scientific knowledge. So to what extent are to use a slightly anachronistic term, but to what extent are the cunning folk of the South Pacific themselves appropriately called witches, as administrators often called them, or to what extent might they represent forms of knowledge which don't perhaps can't be compared in the same way with ways in which knowledge forming has been developed in Europe, for instance.
I don't think humanities scholarship is producing absolute truth. I think the work I do is producing a new interpretation in light of my own present moment, in light of what's occurred over the centuries separating me from whatever I'm studying, and what that new vantage point illuminates in the past. So I think the truth that would emerge, and this is not unusual, I would hope most academics most scholars in the humanities would think that the truth, the ultimate truth of their work as scholars is to show us that truth is an ongoing act of interpretation, and that knowledge is not final. They've not discovered the final truth. Future people will criticize them, and aspects of works from centuries back will be understood in new ways, and new meaning will emerge from those works in generations to come.